Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
A new IG report reveals the IRS sent incorrect taxpayer data to the Department of Education, raising serious questions about how federal agencies exchange sensitive information. As the Department of Government Efficiency pushes for broader data consolidation across government, and as the IRS continues to shed staff and funding, this slip-up shows how one error can ripple across systems and put personal privacy at risk. Here to unpack the findings and what they mean for future data sharing efforts is the Director of Systems Operations at the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, Jenna Whitley. Ms. Whitley, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today.
I want to start with the background. Tell us about the Future Act and how it gets the IRS involved in student aid data.
Well, the Future Act stands for the Fostering Undergraduate Talent by Unlocking Resources for Education, which is a mouthful. That was passed back in December of 2019. And what that actually did was allow the IRS to share information with the Department of Education. So it set up a new information sharing agreement between those two federal agencies, but only in the case where taxpayers provided consent for the IRS to do so. So that took a little bit of special coding for these systems to talk to each other. But that's where it all started.
And so you at the Treasury IG did an investigation of this data exchange. What happened? What did you find?
Well, we didn't start an investigation until actually last year. And what happened was we were notified, or actually the Department of Education publicly announced that the IRS was sending incorrect data, taxpayer data, to the FAFSA application system. And for those of your listeners who don't have kids or kids close to going to college, the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. So anytime, the IRS makes errors like this, data sharing errors, my agency is, of course, going to investigate. And in this particular case, that announcement was made back in April of 2024, the first year, which was just last year, that this system went live. But in this particular instance, the IRS fixed the problem before we even started our audit work. And by that, I mean they confirmed the errors, they tested and coded a fix, and reprocessed over 7 million applications in 8 days after being informed by the Department of Education. So if you take a look at our report, we have a detailed timeline about the events that took place and what happened, and a lot of information about the data information that shared itself.
Was this data information sharing agreement part of the rollout of the new FAFSA that was so problematic?
I don't know that it was a part of the new FAFSA. The part that we actually audited was the coding of the IRS system itself. I think those two things happen concurrently. The FAFSA application is processed actually by the Department of Education. The part that we audited is the IRS system that provides that information to the Department of Education.
But the data sharing was designed to make it easier and simpler to file the FAFSA, correct?
Absolutely.
As you dug into the situation after the Department of Education brought it to light, what were some of the things that you found? Was it a one-time thing, or was there a deeper systematic problem?
I'd like to think it was just a one-time thing. We're all, auditors are often cautious and hopelessly optimistic and making recommendations for improvement. But what we found actually was, in this case, a university administrator was watching the different packages that were coming back for their admitted students, and they're the ones who notified the Department of Education of the problem. So as soon as the Department of Education made that announcement, then the IRS started working on, okay, what happened where, and how can we fix this going forward? So to provide some of that context, what happened, tax administration is extremely complex. You have hundreds of systems that process the tax code. And by that, I mean their last count, there were over 700 business applications on the IRS enterprise. And any time like a new law is passed, like the Future Act, as we already talked about, coding changes have to be made or new systems are created altogether. That happened with the Affordable Care Act. That happened with the Taxpayer First Act, with the Inflation Reduction Act. Each one of these legal changes requires generally a new system to be implemented or developed from the ground up. And it just further complicates the tax code. Another note is about half of those systems are legacy systems, which just means they're really old. Some of them are no longer being patched by vendors. The legacy systems that actually process the tax for businesses and individuals were mostly developed by the IRS themselves, but a lot of those old systems don't have any kind of documentation that explains fields and the data contained in those fields. So in between different systems, you may have fields that are named the same thing, but actually contain different kinds of data. And I don't want to get too technical for your listeners, but this really adds complexity to anything where you're just like, oh, I just want to retrieve a taxpayer AGI, for example, or your adjusted gross income for one taxpayer. Well, it's not always, that easy to just go find a number in one system. One last comment on that is one of the great things actually about the IRS is they do fix their mistakes, and they fix them all the time. If they've overbilled you, they issue a check. If they say that you owe too much tax, and they'll revise that throughout the year. But a benefit to the taxpayer itself is that taxpayers can also make changes throughout the year. And that's where this actually contributed to this FAFSA application system, because not all of those amendment changes were coded into this new process. So once they fixed that, they reprocessed all the 7 million plus applications for 2024, and hopefully now going forward things will be fine. But we'll continue to look at that.
I'm speaking with Jenna Whitley. She's the Director for Systems Operations at the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. Your point there about the complexity of the tax code and all of the different databases that support it leads me to ask what recommendations you made as you did the analysis for systematic fixes so this doesn't happen in the future.
One of the things that we did find that we would have normally made recommendations about would have been with regards to the testing data that they used. They used the same testing package, and it's just basically general fake tax information, if you will. They use it for all of their different releases. Had the IRS used masked live data, these errors could have been identified before sharing any information with the Department of Education. And this kind of complicated, but an easy way to think about this is using the same package of sample data through all of their development and testing is a little bit like teaching to the test. The system can get everything right if you're sending through the same package of questions and data over and over again. But is that a real test of a system's performance? No, it really isn't. So in one case, we would have said, perhaps if this were a larger system, you should have used live taxpayer data. But because we only looked at this small system in this particular instance, we didn't want to make that recommendation for future systems that may be working on, because the bulk of live data can be extremely cumbersome, even if it's masked. So we didn't make any recommendations in this report, except we will be continuing to look at all of the different APIs and data sharing agreements that the IRS is going to be engaging in the next few years.
Well, you've mentioned a couple of times that this was a small system, a small piece of the total tax system that you looked at, and yet it was a pretty significant breach. I mean, personal information was released. The Trump administration has made no secret of how it wants to open up this data system to lots of other cross matches. What are the key lessons that we should be learning here before we do apply or mix IRS data with other sorts of federal data?
Yeah, I agree. The March 2025 executive order, the one that's stopping waste, fraud, and abuse by eliminating information silos, that one aims to remove barriers and promote interagency data sharing agreements. That's a little bit of concern for us because, the Section 6103 of the Internal Revenue Tax Code has been around for 50 years. And that essentially says your personal taxpayer data is private information, unless, of course, you're being investigated for some law enforcement purpose. So that's one of the unique things that the FAFSA system, the IRS encoded. They ensured before that information was sent to the Department of Education that the taxpayer gave consent for the IRS to release that information. The other concern is this is a small scope system because you only have a very small section of our country who currently have children that are college aged. So this was a very small subset of individual taxpayers. The concern is if you expand this out to other broader interagency sharing agreements, what errors are going to be made in, that data that's shared? And, how efficient is that if the IRS has to go back and make changes. What decisions are going to be made based on, data that could be incorrect.
Well, and the IRS has had a pretty significant staff reduction as well. So do they have the people left to make sure that the coding is correct so it doesn't happen again?
Whew, that is a tough one. I don't know. I just read one of my colleagues' reports, and I think they've lost over a quarter of their information technology experts. And, that is another something that we're going to be looking at. Even as an IT auditor, I typically audit systems and not human resources and that kind of thing. But that definitely gives us some concern going forward about not just, administering the tax code itself, but the modernization programs that were already in flight before all of this happened. I mean, the IRS has been working on their enterprise data platform for several years now. And that is a system that looks to deconflict all the different fields and data that happen across those hundreds of systems. And if, production or if work stopped on modernization programs like that, it's just going to further delay the modernization efforts that this administration and all the previous administrations hope to gain with modernizing the IRS.
I've been speaking with Jenna Whitley. She's the Director of Systems Operations for the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. Thanks so much for sharing this report and its lessons with us.
You are most welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll post this interview along with a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former Senior Advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites and airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again, and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization. Really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down, and work hard, etc. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up do so politely, with courage, etc., even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helps shape my belief around diversity. DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences, and that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one coming from the insurance industry. That's an industry which is working on that. It's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business, and more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge, and how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this? Certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority, and that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that, like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction, but of course it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. That's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. Absolutely stay open to the unexpected. Say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy. It's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking. And then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it. Share the credit. Perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him and as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has Pearls of Wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.